We're going to take a look at the pancreas in this video. So the pancreas is another 2-for-1 gland. So there's an exocrine part of the pancreas where digestive enzymes are secreted through a duct into the duodenum, the first part of the small intestine. And then there's an endocrine part of the pancreas, where in the islets of Langerhans, there's the beta cells that secrete the hormone insulin, and the alpha cells secrete the hormone glucagon. So here's where the pancreas is located. It's just right below the stomach. And if you take a look under the microscope, there are these little islands or islets of Langerhans. These are the endocrine part of the pancreas, where the beta and alpha cells are that secrete the hormones insulin and glucagon. And then surrounding that are the exocrine glands that secrete the digestive enzymes. And those digestive enzymes will travel down the pancreatic duct and then empty into the duodenum in the small intestine. Here's a close-up of one of the islets of Langerhans. So in the middle, we've got the beta cells secreting the hormone insulin, and we've got the alpha cells secreting glucagon. And then surrounding that, we've got the exocrine glands that are making and secreting the digestive enzymes. So the hormone insulin is a protein hormone, and its job is to decrease blood glucose. So it's going to tell the cells in the body that, hey, there's a lot of glucose out there. So go ahead and stick your glucose carrier proteins out so you can take the glucose in so you can use that as an energy source. And insulin is also an anabolic hormone. So it's going to build up the energy stores. So that's important to remember. So any glucose that's not used for energy can be stored for later in the liver and skeletal muscle. And so insulin will stimulate glycogenesis and tell the skeletal muscle and liver to make glycogen. And then insulin will also stimulate lipogenesis and tell the adipose to make triglycerides. And then it also stimulates synthesis of proteins. So would insulin be secreted in the absorptive or post-absorptive state? So it's going to be secreted in the absorptive state because you've just eaten, and that's when there's lots of glucose in the blood. So that's when your pancreas will secrete insulin to tell your cells, hey, put out your glucose carrier proteins. There's lots of glucose out there. And then you can go ahead and take that in and use that as an energy source. This just shows the actions of insulin. So the insulin secreted from the beta cells in the pancreas will travel through the blood to many of the tissues in the body, tell them to put out their glucose carrier proteins so they can take the glucose up, use that for energy, and also tell them to take up amino acids in the blood from the diet, make proteins, tells the adipose tissue to take up the fatty acids, make triglycerides, tells the liver and skeletal muscle, if you have any extra glucose, store that as glycogen. And then also will tell the liver to take up fatty acids, make some triglycerides there, and also to not do any gluconeogenesis because we don't want to be making any new glucose right now because we just ate and we've got lots of glucose running around in the blood. And this is just a nice picture view of what insulin is doing. So you've just eaten, you've got lots of nutrients in the blood, and so insulin is going to tell your cells, hey, take all of those nutrients that are in the blood and move those into the cells. And so we can move the glucose in, store it for later, as glycogen in the liver and skeletal muscle. We can also take fatty acids or any other extra nutrients and make triglycerides or fat. And we can take amino acids and make those into proteins. So you can see that insulin is an anabolic hormone. It's going to build up your energy stores. And this is just showing you how insulin works. So here's the insulin receptor. It's a cell surface receptor because insulin is a protein hormone. It's hydrophilic. And insulin receptor is actually an enzyme-linked receptor. So when insulin binds, that turns on the enzyme, which is a tyrosine kinase enzyme. And remember, kinase enzymes phosphorylate proteins. And so these phosphorylated proteins will stimulate the cell response, which will be to put out these glucose carrier proteins on the cell membrane, and then the cell can bring the glucose into the cell by facilitated diffusion. And then how we control insulin secretion is by negative feedback. So when glucose levels start to decrease in the blood, negative feedback will occur and tell the pancreas that, hey, we don't need to be secreting as much insulin anymore because the blood glucose is starting to drop. Glucagon is another protein hormone secreted by the pancreas, but this is secreted by the alpha cells instead. And it does the exact opposite of what insulin does. So it's going to increase blood glucose. So remember that insulin decreased the blood glucose. Glucagon is going to increase blood glucose. And also it's catabolic. So it's going to mobilize the energy stores. And so you're going to start breaking those energy stores down to release those into the blood. So it'll stimulate glycogenolysis. So you're going to break down the glycogen stores and release that glucose into the blood. You'll break down proteins, do lipolysis, break down your triglycerides, release the fatty acids into the blood so cells can use that as an energy source. And glucose will be spared for the nervous system to use, because remember, the brain really can't use other things for making ATP besides glucose and ketones. And it also will stimulate the liver to do gluconeogenesis. So liver will start making new glucose from things that aren't carbohydrates. So when would glucagon be secreted? Would that be during the absorptive or during the post-absorptive state? So this would be during the post-absorptive state, because it's been at least 3 or 4 hours since you've eaten. Nutrient levels are getting low, and so that's when the pancreas will secrete glucagon. And you'll start to break down your energy stores and release that into the blood to try to increase the nutrients available for the cells to use for energy. And then this is just a nice picture showing the actions of glucagon being released from the alpha cells in the pancreas. So glucagon will tell you to break down your energy stores, so going to the liver, breaking down your glycogen stores, and then telling the liver to do gluconeogenesis, breaking down proteins, going to the adipose, telling you to break down your fats, and releasing that into the blood. And then this is just a nice picture just to remind you that glucagon will tell your body to break down your energy stores. So you'll break down glycogen, protein stores, triglyceride stores, do some gluconeogenesis here, and then release those nutrients into the blood, because it's been a while since you've eaten, and that will increase the nutrients in the blood to provide an energy source for your cells to use. And as far as regulating the blood glucose levels, the normal range for the blood glucose is between 70 to 100 milligrams per deciliter. You do not have to memorize that. But if you get out of the normal range and you go above the normal range, that's called hyperglycemia. Hyper meaning more than, and then glyce is talking about the sugar or glucose, and emia is talking about the blood. And if you have hyperglycemia that's sustained, then that is diabetes mellitus, which we'll talk about in the next lecture. And that can cause all kinds of problems in the body. And then hypoglycemia is the opposite. So that's when the blood glucose gets too low. And that can cause you to feel weak. And if it gets way too low, it can actually cause seizures. And that's because the brain isn't getting enough glucose to make enough energy, and things go a little haywire there. And how we maintain the blood glucose levels within that normal range is through the negative feedback actions of insulin and glucagon. And if you notice, they have the opposite effects of each other, so they're antagonistic to each other. And this just shows you a picture from your book, response to hyperglycemia. So if the blood glucose gets too high, so for example, after you eat a meal, then the beta cells in the pancreas will secrete insulin, and they will act to decrease the blood glucose. And then if your blood glucose gets too low, you're hypoglycemic, so maybe it's been a while since you've eaten, alpha cells in the pancreas will secrete glucagon, and they will act to raise the blood glucose. And then this is just a really nice, simple picture that will be good to remember, because it just shows you that insulin and glucagon have the opposite effects of each other. Insulin will act to lower the blood glucose, and glucagon will act to raise the blood glucose. Okay, and then just to finish up our cheat sheet for our studying, so we've got the pancreas we've added here. So the two hormones the pancreas secretes are insulin and glucagon. Insulin will decrease the blood glucose. It's also anabolic. It'll build up the energy stores. And the problem we have with insulin secretion or responding to insulin is diabetes mellitus, type 1 and type 2, which we'll talk about in the next lecture. And then the pancreas also secretes glucagon, which will increase the blood glucose, and it's catabolic, so it'll mobilize or break down the energy stores.